Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Fisher, the treasurer of PEP. So I'll be talking just for a couple minutes. These are the Shafer Lecture speakers since the series began in honor of longtime PEP member and anti-nuclear weapons campaigner Mark Shafer. 2013's speaker Phil Donahue was a legendary talk show host and producer of the documentary Body of War, covering an injured soldier returning from Iraq. Gail Walker delivered 2014's Shafer Lecture. She's a leader of Pastors for Peace and organizer of Aid to Cuba. 2016's event featured Christian Parenti, author of Tropic of Chaos: Climate Change and the New Geography of Violence. Anti-fascist historian Timothy Snyder, then at Yale, now at University of Toronto, gave the Shafer Lecture in 2017. In 2019, anti-nuclear war campaigner Frida Berrigan gave the Shafer Lecture. Mazen Kamsaya, director of the Palestine Museum of Natural History, delivered 2017's remarks. In 2021, Christian Sebastian McJetters spoke about animal liberation and its intersections with other struggles against oppression. Brian Tokar, educator and campaigner for climate justice and social ecology, spoke in 2024. And if I'm not mistaken, I saw he joined as a guest. Welcome, Brian. And this year, our speaker is Aly Wane.
Stage is yours.
Great, thank you. And let me know if there's any lag on my end. I'm not sure if my connection is good, but I certainly hope that it is. Um, I'm really honored to be able to join you in this conversation. Um, I mean, honored on the one hand, and what was kind of exciting about this was it's the first time that I've seen the list of the other speakers, and many of the other speakers are people that, I'm aware of, that I've looked up to or that I've looked to for some kind of direction over the years. So it does feel at least like I'm in good company. And I do also simply want to thank this group for this opportunity to talk about this issue, which feels, incredibly relevant, even though, I'm not gonna lie, I feel a little bit sad today, as I have been feeling for quite a while. Uh, the fact that it is so important to talk about what I called the crisis of mass dehumanization. And actually, before the Zoom, we were talking about whether or not it should be dehumanization single or dehumanization plural. Uh, but certainly the reality is that we are dealing with an era of immense cruelty, um, and immense cruelty, immense amnesia also, which is extremely dangerous. And before I even get into the bulk of my conversation, I'd like to do something which I sometimes do in my presentations, which is to maybe pause and have 30 seconds worth of silence so that we can sort of on an individual level think about people who have passed, who have inspired you. But also, I think it would be good to spend this 30 seconds to think about just the mounting number of people who are unfortunately being exterminated through this new round of war, this attack on Iran and slash Lebanon, which is just a continuing attack on what's been going on in Palestine as well, and which is really reverberating and expanding everywhere. So if you could just take 30 seconds just to think about the people that you love who have inspired you, who've passed, but also the people who unfortunately recently have been killed by these wars of empire. So I'm just going to take 30 seconds. Okay. Um, so I think I think it's important to take this time to think about the people who came before us, but it's also really important in the context of this conversation to think about um, kind of what goes with this crisis of mass dehumanization, right? And I would say that one of the things that fuels the crisis of mass dehumanization and that makes it more perpetual is simply the fact that living in an empire means that we live in a country that mass produces death, but that does not honor grief. And that is actually one of the things that I believe leads to a lot of, mental health issues in this country, because this country unfortunately produces so much death and so much grief, both domestically and internationally. And yet at the same time, there isn't respect for the time that it needs for human beings to process the harm that is being done by this empire. And I'm going to get into some of the specifics about this crisis in Iran in a little bit. But one of the things that I was thinking about this past week as I was preparing for this thing is just the mounting number of casualties that is already happening in our names right now. So, as of today, if you simply look at the number of casualties in Iran and in Lebanon, because of Israel's sort of parallel attack in Lebanon, we are already at about 2,200 deaths. 2,200 deaths. And if you look at your kind of regular, the regular media channels right now, it's almost unremarked. It is almost unremarked, that level of death. And one of the things that I can tell you about being an anti-war activist, and one of the things that sort of pushed me towards becoming an anti-war activist is when I was doing some research many, many years ago at the beginning of my journey as an activist. I actually found that social scientists have determined that now, because of the power of our weaponry, when you are in a theater of war, it is statistically more likely for you to die if you're a civilian in that theater of war than if you are a soldier. Now, think about this, right? Like, war is, of course, a barbarity, a horror, one of the worst things that human beings can do. But over the many centuries, there has been at least a kind of outline and a framework for quote unquote the rules of war. And a big impetus for that framework, for the creation of that framework, is to separate civilians from combatants. The idea that as and the idea is that as regrettable as it is that war produces so much death, at the very least, we should try to keep those deaths confined within people who are intentional combatants and who have signed up for this war, even though, of course, that's a complicated question in terms of who signs up for the war. You could say that it's voluntary, but very often it's compulsory, and sometimes for economic reasons. Uh, but unfortunately, the reality of modern warfare is that actually you are much more likely to die as a civilian than you are as a soldier, which is actually one of the major reasons why I oppose war overall, is that I think we have crossed the threshold where our weapons are so powerful that we can't even distinguish anymore. Um, and I did want to actually ground these remarks in an experience that I had when I was younger, which really cemented my path towards becoming an anti-war activist. My mother, God rest her soul, passed away in 1999, but she brought me here as an immigrant to this country all the way back in 1985, and she used to work at the United Nations. And all the way back in 1990, I followed her to the country that she was assigned to. And the country that she was assigned to was Rwanda in Africa. And I got to spend about a year and a half in Rwanda. And unfortunately, 1990 is when some of the fighting in Rwanda started that expanded into what unfortunately the world got to know as the Rwandan genocide a couple of years later. Uh, Now, to be clear, by the time I left Rwanda, and the only reason that I was able to leave and evacuate Rwanda was because I was the son of a diplomat. And so I was able to leave before the fighting really got, to those genocidal levels. Um, but all I did was, so I was a kid, I was 13 years old. I experienced all of about a week's worth of warfare, just about a week's worth. And clearly not as a combatant, just as a civilian. And I was largely inside the compound that we stayed in. And I just remember hearing, the machine gun fire, the tanks, all of that, and just being absolutely terrified. And I often tell people, this happened when I was 13 years old. I am 49 years old now. That memory has absolutely imprinted itself in me, and I believe genuinely that my nervous system was kind of permanently changed from that point on. I mean, there was a before and an after. Now, I experienced a week's worth of war in a relatively privileged place. I mean, I did see some awful things, but I didn't get to experience what a lot of my Rwandan friends, for example, experienced. And all of it lasted for a week. And to this day, I can immediately go back to that sense of fear, that sense of terror. And I remember one of the things that I kept thinking about at the time was um, how how unfair it was that as a civilian, I had basically didn't make any decision about the fighting, but that there were people who had more power than me, who had decided basically that my life was not as important as their political goals. And from that point on, I decided to become an anti-war activist. And thankfully, through the Syracuse Peace Council and other organizations, I have been able to do that. And the reason I'm starting with that story is because um, years later, um, right after the October 7th attacks in Israel. By then, I had already done a little bit of organizing. Well, not just a little bit. Actually, I'd started organizing on Palestine in the early 2000s. But by the time we got to October 7th and the attacks on Israel, I remember hearing about that attack. And at that time, I already understood the incredibly brutal calculus that comes with the fighting of the IDF, of the Israeli Defense Forces. And unfortunately, the kind of ratio that had already been accepted by the international order, which was largely that basically for every one Israeli person who even experienced discomfort, you could experience maybe, I don't know, 100 dead Palestinians. I mean, the disproportion is insane. And I'm relating that story specifically because once I understood the impact of that attack on Israel, I think that I spent the next 3 days in a kind of a panic mode. And that panic mode kind of reminded me of how I felt when I was 13 years old. And it was the strangest experience. I remember feeling like I was seeing visions of blood. Like I knew it was coming. I knew that we would be seeing um, killing on an industrial level. And certainly, along with many, many people, not just in the United States, but across the globe, and of course, in solidarity of Palestinian resistance itself, I did everything that I could with movement activists to basically stop the genocide before it could happen. And unfortunately, because of the power structures that were in place, we were not able to do so. And we now live in a globe where we've all basically the ones of us who've been paying attention, we've all had to watch a live stream genocide, a live stream genocide. And the thing that sort of drives me insane about that is that in earlier eras, at the very least, we didn't have the kind of technology that we have now that makes this kind of killing so immediate to us. But now, during this genocide, all of us, and I mean by all of us, I'm even very much including kids could pick up, their phones, get on Instagram, get on TikTok, and TikTok was definitely banned because of censorship around the genocide. Um, we could all pick up this live stream genocide, watch people get slaughtered and ethnically cleansed, and then we would go back home and turn on the news and hear all sorts of excuses and justifications for this killing. Um, and I would like to suggest that this is not just, wrong ethically because of the genocide. It's also wrong in the sense that it gives you a sense of how of the immense distance that we have now between the actions of our government and our ability to basically stop these actions. And also how far we have gone to already dehumanize an entire people. And one of the many things that sort of drives me insane, you're definitely going to hear me use this expression quite a bit. One of the many things that drives me insane about all of this is that um, we now live in a society where we have the capacity to see the victims of empire, but we do not have the direct capacity to stop these immense wars. Bringing it back to the present, for example, now we're in such a crisis of democracy in the United States, right? That when Trump launched his attack on Iran, which could very easily move the entire globe towards World War III in terms of all of the potential interconnections there that could make this crisis a global one. There wasn't even a debate in Congress about this. Now, to be clear, the debates that we have in Congress about these wars are very often rubber stamp debates. And one of the things that is, very tough about living in the United States in the belly of the beast of the empire is that the United States is an incredibly militaristic society. And unfortunately, it is very, very, very easy to um, be able to convince American people that it is worth going to war. But, those of us who were activists around the Iraq War, remember that at the time there was at the very least a debate. Now we have gotten to the point when we have an imperial presidency that has basically imposed these genocides, and these mass killings on us in a way that is completely undemocratic. And to be clear, I actually believe that the United States currently is not really a democracy. At best, it is an oligarchy. At best, we are ruled by the wealthy. We are not actually ruled by democracy, which would mean that we would have more of an input into these debacles. And I ran into a um, a quote earlier today that really kind of, I think, encompasses what I'm trying to convey here. And it is from I just found it on social media. The person's last name is Charisse. It's B. Charisse, and maybe it's an activist that one of you might know. Actually, I think that a friend of mine knows who she is, so I'll have to reach out to him to get the information. But the quote that she wrote really feels important to this talk. She says, I don't think that the average person born and raised in the US realizes how much they've been propagandized to dehumanize people from around the world. And this goes for non-white people who were born and raised here as well. We have been fed monstrous lies for decades. And no, this did not begin with Trump. This administration has simply removed the veil and exposed what this government has always been: ruthless, tyrannical, and imperial. Now, that's an intense quote, um, but that is certainly a reality. And I think because I had that early experience, unfortunately, of warfare as a child, one of the things that I've always thought about in terms of the American people is very much connected to this quote. I've always felt that one of the things that is tragic about being a US citizen is that most US citizens don't understand nor realize that they live in a brutal militaristic empire. Um, and it pains me to say this. You know, I'm immigrant. I came here in 1985. My mom used to work at the United Nations. She had all of those ideals that come with being an immigrant in America. But certainly the reality in terms of my studying the history of this country is that this country produces a tremendous amount of debt that is externalized and that is away from the eyes and ears of the average citizens. And not only do citizens very often not see the impact of that tragedy, but very often it is discouraged or media um, sort of makes it hard to find the information that you need. But this actually kind of reminds me of kind of my origin as an activist, which was, as for a lot of people, was really the aftermath of 9/11. I remember I was in Chicago at the time of 9/11, and I actually remember I have the specific memory of watching the towers fall. And almost in real time as it was happening, I remember having two thoughts slash emotions at the same time. The number one was, of course, the human reaction to the horror that I was beholding, which was that these buildings were falling, tons of people were getting killed, and as someone who had already lost, unfortunately, quite a few folks in my life, including my mom, who ended up passing away in 1999, I immediately understood the amount of grief that would come with all of these deaths. But the second reaction that I had was this country is going to turn extremely brutal and is going to externalize this violence. And my life as an immigrant just got much worse. Much, much worse. I mean, even back then, it was very easy for me to understand that this attack on the US, which could actually very much be explained as simply blowback from the imperial externalizations of the US, that domestically what this was going to look like was the creation of Fortress America. And as an immigrant, I knew that unfortunately I would become one of its victims. Um, so maybe I'll actually stop here before I get into a little bit of my own personal narrative and then go into this broader crisis that we are in. I know that I can go on for a while, so I like to at least, you know, either pause to see if there are any questions before I move on, because I don't want to simply subject you to me just droning on. But then I will get into my own personal story, and then we'll get into the meat of the subject here. So if there are any questions, this could be a good moment to field one?
So there were some things that I wanted to say. If I can just go ahead, if nobody else has questions. Yeah, I wasn't sure. Like, I mean, I could bring them up now, or I could wait more until the end. But yeah, but this is already raising so many thoughts for me. I really liked what you said at the beginning about how so much of this dehumanization is driven by the fact that we live in a society that just like has really no healthy way of dealing with the reality of grief. And I think that's very, very important. And I mean, and like one of the things that's just been weighing on me so much emotionally recently is the fact that we live in like this world where it's just, I mean, this has always been a part of how capitalism functions, obviously, but like we live very much in a world where it just feels like life just has no value.
Yes.
And like you see that, and you see that like everywhere. Like, I mean, like where I currently live, like there's like a major homelessness crisis, and like there's just like extreme rhetoric around dehumanization of unhoused people,
Mhm.
and then also, I mean, I was thinking, of course, about COVID as well, and how like that's another example that I think is very significant of just this like refusal to really acknowledge the reality of grief or process grief like just gets turned into like mass dehumanization and like this real cheapening of life, like where it was just this mentality of, oh, go back to normal, like go back to brunch, go back to the movies, and so on and so forth, and like just like this acceptance of like, oh, it's okay to infect everybody, including vulnerable people. And like that's something I struggle with a lot. And there was also a historical connection there with the 1918 flu pandemic, and like what happened after that, and like we see the Second World War and like the Holocaust, and there's just this normalization of like that a lot of people are going to die, and like that just gets accepted. And then also, like I'm kind of going on here, but like another thing that came to my mind, like in terms of thinking about dehumanization and mass dehumanization, is the AI situation where with these tech bro billionaires, like they're looking forward to this future in which everybody's going to get replaced with AI. And then like you wonder, like so many of us have this question, like, well, in this future, like who's going to be like, I mean, like how is anybody going to afford food? Like how is anybody going to afford like somewhere to live? Like, I mean, if all the jobs get replaced with AI, and
Mhm.
and how is anybody gonna be able to afford to survive? But like it's just like that's something that like just like is of no concern to these tech bro billionaires. And in terms of the literal dehumanization, it's like with the tech bro billionaires, it seems that it's like they don't want to be human anymore. Like they have all these ridiculous escape fantasies about like becoming like immortal or going into space, or like I don't know, downloading your consciousness onto a floppy disk or something. It's like these are people like who have just like they've become so detached from like just what makes human
Mhm.
existence a good life that they just yeah, they just want to reject all of it, and they just want to live like in their own sterile bubble somewhere. And like they don't care what happens to the rest of us.
Mhm.
So yeah, obviously like very heavy topic and a lot that it's bringing to my mind.
Yeah, no, those are
Much
great points, and
for giving this talk.
I'm so glad, first of all, that you mentioned COVID. COVID, I think, was a real, I mean, affirmation of just the immense amount of detachment that we have from death. One of my friends is the Native American organizer and writer Kelly Hayes, and she's out of Chicago, and she helped put together this thing online called We Grieve Together, and it was this project that was like once we reached about it was a half a million people who died from COVID, and a lot of us activists were just like, where are the public recognitions of grief? And she helped put together this kind of commemoration, but I remember just being shocked about this. I'm also glad that you bring up both AI and also the fantasies of the people who are leading us. You have to understand, like all of these oligarchs, they get so much publicity and they're sort of lionized as these brilliant people. From my perspective, a lot of these oligarchs are certifiably insane. Certifiably insane. And what I mean by that is that if you listen to the theories that they have about the world, they really don't see themselves as human. They really don't. They're already talking about transhumanism. They're talking about transcending humanity. That's why Elon Musk, I believe Elon Musk talks about how his phrase is that he wants to extend the light of consciousness to the heavens, which is like PR way of saying that he wants to build a couple of rocket ships to go to Mars eventually to build colonies there. And of course, we don't have the technology for that. It's insane. And yet these people are deified almost, but they do not see the rest of us as their peers. They have sort of transcended, which is something which explains some of the policies that they are championing. And they certainly found a friend in Donald Trump with that.
Yeah, no, because it's
Um,
this idea that like it's because like this like all their ideas are so dependent upon technology that just doesn't exist and probably is never going to exist. And
yeah, I mean they're going to be long dead before we get even close to the fantasy that they're talking about, which is pretty insane. But I do need to get back to the to sort of the main thrust of this conversation. I wanted to do a quick detour, sort of a personal bio detour in terms of why am I talking to you guys? So partly it's because I'm an activist, but also partly in terms of this particular era, I'm an undocumented activist. I have been an undocumented immigrant in this country since about 1996 or so. And instead of giving you the long immigration story, what I can tell you is that I came here legally as a kid. And I was originally under two different visas. So my mom brought me as her kid, and I was on what was a so-called diplomatic visa. And then I finished my school here, my high school, and then did a little bit of college here in the States. And I changed my visa status from diplomatic to student visa in order to be able to do so. And then, unfortunately, in 1996, I was on this student visa, but my family basically ran out of money to pay for schooling. And because my student visa expired, that's when I technically became undocumented. And then, unfortunately, tragedy struck in 1999. My mother died. She was actually killed by my stepfather, which was a pretty awful, brutal tragedy to get through. But that also cemented my problem with immigration. And the reason I'm talking about the mechanism here is that even though I was brought to this country as a 9-year-old, and by the time I lost my immigration status, I was maybe 22. I had grew up culturally American, like a lot of undocumented people. I'd grown up culturally American, but both of those visa statuses neither of those counts towards citizenship or getting a green card or any of that. So even though I spent all of those years here, it from the point of view of trying to gain U.S. citizenship, none of those years mattered. The immigration system that we have right now is incredibly strict, and it has only gotten stricter and stricter and stricter. And to sort of catch you up to where we are right now, um, my sister, who was eventually be able to become a citizen through a different path than I was, she was able to sponsor me for a green card. We started the green card process all the way back in 2012. And as of today, uh, if the immigration process isn't worsened, I still have to wait until 2029 to get to the point of the line where I can actually apply for the green card. And then after that, there's a 5-year process to stay here. And of course, you'd better be, you can't commit, even the most minor crime. And then eventually you can become a citizen. Now, I've been in this country most of my life. It is as close to a home country as I've had. And under this system, I am still basically quite a few years away from being able to get my green card. And one of the things that I think is really important for people to understand is I am one of the lucky ones. I am now an immigration activist. I've worked with quite a few undocumented organizers over the many years. And what I can tell you is many undocumented people, I would say the majority of undocumented people, don't even have a path to citizenship. So you hear all this rhetoric, right, about like conservatives talking about like, oh, there are all these undocumented, all these illegals. They're too lazy to go through the process. I guess they just don't want to go through the process, blah, 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 blah. But the reality is that for the vast majority of undocumented people, there's no process. There's no process. In fact, I was just talking to a friend today who is a longtime undocumented activist. I came out publicly in the movement along with a lot of other people in the early 2010s to push the conversation on immigration. And when I think of all of us who came out in the early 2010s to do organizing, well, very, very few of us have actually been able to become citizens or to become legal since. Because even with all of the fighting, and I gotta tell you, those of us who are undocumented organizers, we put out all of the stops, nonviolent direct actions, infiltrating detention centers, stopping traffic, like we did everything. And we never even got to an immigration reform piece of legislation that would help us. So many of the folks who were doing all that activism, obviously myself included, are still undocumented. And this is actually just to give you a little bit of an insight into the quote unquote crisis of immigration that we have. That is actually at the heart of the immigration crisis. I think that the immigration crisis is talked about as if um, there's just like all of these people coming into this country and the undocumented population is exploding and what are you going to do? But actually what is happening is that there's so many undocumented people who are trapped inside the US with no path to citizenship. And every single time there is some kind of moral panic about immigration, both parties get together and agree to increase enforcement, increase basically kind of making lives harder for immigrants, and narrow the paths to citizenship. And so over the years, what has been happening is that with each one of these crises, because you haven't solved the problem of actually allowing people to become legal, the actual overall numbers of undocumented people have kept going up. But that's not because people don't want to legalize, it's because people can't legalize. And so I just always want to share that because very often, people talk about this as if it's about personal responsibility, as if it's about kind of the unwillingness of immigrants to get right with the system, to learn the language, quote unquote. That's just not true. I don't know any undocumented person who's just like, hey, this is great. Like, yeah, I'm totally cool with being illegal and not having access to all of these services, struggling to even, get a driver's license, struggling to get access to the most basic things. You don't choose that. You're just stuck in that limbo, unfortunately. And unfortunately, now we are in this era of mass dehumanization as expressed by MAGA politics and Donald Trump's politics. And there's no other way to say it, but we are in the midst of an era of immigrant hunting pogroms. That's where we are. Immigrants are being hunted. I include myself in this conversation, even though I've been undocumented and I've been an organizer for many years, and I've developed a certain level of resilience about being in this kind of shaky status. I mean, there are still moments, though, that, I'm just driving from point A to point B and I'm starting to wonder, like, who's that car, like right behind me? Like, it gets to you, this sense that you are constantly watched and constantly hunted. And when I say hunted, by the way, I mean that quite literally. It's not just that we have increased the funding for ICE and increased the funding for Border Patrol, but the Trump administration has formalized bounty hunting teams, bounty hunting teams for immigrants. And of course, the rhetoric is the rhetoric of dehumanization, right? The rhetoric is the rhetoric of we are going after these people because they're criminals, they're dirty, they're violent, all of that. And the reality is that the Trump administration was lying from the beginning. that they were very clear that they were going after every immigrant that they possibly could. And the proof of that, by the way, is that the opening salvo of this mass deportations project was, and I'm sure many of you remember this, was the sending of quote unquote gang members to a max security prison in El Salvador. So that was what the Trump administration told us they were doing. Within like the first week or two after that happened, the news was already reporting that at least 75% of the people sent to that max security prison had no criminal record whatsoever. I mean, we're not talking like gang members, not no criminal record whatsoever. And that ratio actually went up. It went up since then. I believe that, now the estimates are something like 90% of the people there who, remembered the visualization, right? Remember, people had their heads shaved, they had their hands tied behind their backs, they were humiliated, all of that. And all of that was this big splash about how we're getting rid of the gang members. The Trump administration, what the news found, reporters found subsequently was that the Trump administration knew from the beginning that at the very least, 50% of the people that they sent there had no criminal record whatsoever. They didn't care. Of course they didn't care. We saw Kristi Noem, taking pictures in front of this prison because it was about PR. And that PR is really at the heart of this dehumanization, this idea that there's like this form of human beings that is somehow less than, that deserves less than. But the reason that I'm here giving this lecture to you all is that I understood very quickly, especially having done many years of immigration organizing here, that first of all, the Trump administration was not something new, that it was an escalation of the mass dehumanization of immigrants that had been happening under presidents from both parties. I did a ton of organizing under the Obama administration. It was brutal back then, very brutal. Um, but what I understood very quickly, though, was that the PR around dehumanization of immigrants was simply the beginning of a project of mass dehumanizations that you start with immigrants, and then the other category of people who are highly dehumanized were also our trans community, our trans kinfolk were absolutely at the center of this campaign, this very well-funded campaign to make people believe that trans folks, just as immigrants, somehow are less deserving than other folks. But once I saw that rhetoric kind of escalate around immigrants and around trans folks, and I saw the direction of the MAGA administration, I start to understand, oh my God, like we immigrants are simply the canaries in the coal mine. Like what's coming is an immense amount of dehumanization. And one of the reasons that I wanted to speak to this particular audience is that I would like to make the argument that the dehumanizations that are happening internationally are absolutely connected to the dehumanizations that are happening domestically. That is that it makes sense that we live in a country that is going through immigrant hunting programs, that is demonizing queer folks, especially trans folks, that is demonizing poor people, that is increasingly demonizing people with disabilities. It's like these concentric circles of dehumanization, and they're ever, ever, ever growing. Um, and you have to understand that these phenomena are absolutely linked, that sort of our lack of care for what happens to, for example, Palestinians or what is happening, for example, to the Lebanese right now is connected to our lack of caring for what is happening to people domestically. And of course, leftist organizers for centuries, like we know the solution to this. The solution is solidarity. The solution is continuing to insist that every single human being has the same worth and the same value. Because as soon as you allow one group of people to be dehumanized, you're basically giving powerful people a permission to dehumanize you. Um, and um, the MAGA sort of project is a project that is a dehumanizing project, but that comes from, particularly specific places. And it is actually interesting that this group has a connection to religion because I actually think that the one of the vectors of dehumanization of the MAGA project is white Christian nationalism. And this, the white Christian nationalists who are at the helm of this MAGA project were the same people who were there at the beginning of the Iraq War, at the beginning of the project of the War on Terror. They're the same people who are ecstatic about this war in Iran. And I mean that quite literally ecstatic, because a lot of these white Christian nationalists, their theology is an apocalyptic theology. In their theology, they absolutely literally believe that they are doing the work to bring about the return of Jesus Christ, the Messiah. And here I'm not talking about a metaphor, like the return of Christianity being more popular or something. No, I mean, quite literally, they believe that the war to end all wars is coming. And I don't mean to scare you, but many of these folks are right now at the helm of this violent project that we have in terms of this attack on Iran. Many of them, and I mean, they're not hiding it. Pete Hegseth, our current Secretary of Defense, Secretary of War, whatever he wants to call himself. I mean, he's one of the most embarrassing officials I've ever seen in my life. But he believes that we are in a holy crusade. He comes from that same group. Right after the attack on Iran started, there were reports from soldiers across the country who were saying that some of their commanders were telling them that this was the war for the end times. And the reason why this religious aspect is so important is that unfortunately, religious zealots who believe in these apocalyptic fantasies believe that whatever happens in this world is completely secondary to, in their minds, what happens in the future world. And all of the calamities, all of the cruelties that we are seeing right now, they are simply part of the trials and tribulations that will lead to the battle for Armageddon, that will lead to the return of Jesus. And that is how they justify this huge demonizing of immigrants, this huge demonizing of trans folks, of queer folks, of women. It is the most conservative form of Christian theology that you can find. And it is the form of conservative Christian theology which allows and facilitates a mass dehumanization because in their minds, it's not even that they're the ones, for example, putting immigrants in jail. It's just this nebulous God's will. It's just God's will, you know. And that is actually one of the things that scares me about this version of mass dehumanization that we're going through. It is it's it would be easier if I just came to you and I was just like, well, these people are evil and they're just kind of like they enjoy what they're doing, and that's the end of the story. No, in their minds, they are justified in this cruelty, and they're justified in this dehumanization because in their minds, they're working towards the next world, and that terrifies me. But that also gives you a sense of the link between the project of mass dehumanization that MAGA is pushing and what has always been there in the in the American character. This is just an evolution of the logics that have always been there in the American character in terms of race, religion, gender, um, ways that these vectors can be used to dehumanize different populations. In fact, this is a little bit of a throwback, but I'm thinking to when I first started doing organizing on immigration, and I would talk about the history of mass deportations. In the past, I would start with, the 1980s, which most scholars agree is when the modern era of immigrant incarceration and deportation started. But now, when I talk about the history of mass deportations, I start with the Native American genocide and expulsion of the people there. It was there from the beginning. This is what we're seeing is a modern version of a very American version of dehumanization that has always been there. Um, and that dehumanization has always been connected to, unfortunately, white supremacy and white nationalism in this country. Uh, I remember the first year that I organized on immigration, I would be very nervous about bringing up race because honestly, I was very naive and green in my organizing, and I just didn't want to ruffle feathers, and everything. And then by the end of my first year organizing on immigration, I remember thinking to myself, if I don't bring up race, I'm basically lying to people because you can't have a conversation about citizenship without having a conversation about race. Because in this country, citizenship is very much tied to whiteness, or the way Americans are conceived is very much tied to whiteness, which can bring up some real absurdities. I'll give you just one organizing absurdity, for example, which is even though Barack Obama is considered kind of, more liberal, progressive president, right? Barack Obama presided over a tremendous number of deportations. He actually broke deportation records during the time that he was there. And his logic was basically the same logic that Democrats very often use, which is to simply say, um, I'm going to give you guys this on enforcement, and then eventually Republicans are going to come to the table on immigration reform. And of course, what ended up happening was that he kept giving Republicans more on enforcement. He kept deporting people, and Republicans never came to the table on immigration relief, on paths to citizenships and things like that, which is why he ended up getting the nickname of the deporter in chief. That came from the movement. That came from us because we were watching what was happening in our communities. But the reason I bring up Barack Obama is that the very same state legislatures, usually in the South, Arizona was a big one, that were pushing the worst anti-immigrant legislation, were also the same states that were talking about, hey, maybe Barack Obama is not a real U.S. citizen, right? Because he's black. Now, remember the whole birth certificate conversation that they were asking for his birth certificate, birth certificate, birth certificate. Now, what does that tell you about citizenship in this country, right? That you could become the most powerful official in the country, and there is still a segment of the U.S. population that will look at you as a black man and say, like, is he really a citizen? Right? Like that's race. That's race that's operating here. Um, and in terms of the preceding logics of MAGA, the anti-immigrant movement, which has basically fed the Republican Party, is directly tied to white nativism and eugenics politics. There is this network of think tank called the John Tenton Network of Think Tanks, and includes Numbers USA, FAIR, a couple of different think tanks that are Republican, and they all come from the same white supremacist source. And so, like for example, as an activist, I have been aware of Stephen Miller since maybe late 2000s or so. Stephen Miller, who is basically helming the mass deportations project right now, is someone who was already on the radar of the anti-racist Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a group that has been doing anti-racist for a long time. They got famous doing a lot of work against the Ku Klux Klan. Uh, but the Southern Poverty Law Center, I believe it was as early as the early 2010s, already put Stephen Miller on their list of the 10 most dangerous white nativists in the country. So he's been a known commodity in the movement. And so when people are surprised to see the Department of Homeland Security or the Department of Labor put out stuff on social media that is just plainly coming from white supremacist sources and are just asking themselves, well, where does that come from? What I can tell you as a longtime immigration activist is this was always there. This was always there. It's just that now it is at the forefront, but that has always been the fuel of this anti-immigrant agenda. And I know that the idea, the publicity around the anti-immigrant agenda was, of course, we're going after these criminals, but the reality is that it has always been quite openly a white nationalist project, and now we're seeing it in a much more naked way. Um, Oh God, I'm already running out of time because I keep talking. Um, because I'm running out of time, before I sort of stop, I might actually jump here. And I did want to touch on what Vittoria mentioned actually early on, the piece about AI, social media, and technology. I actually think that all of those things like really help the project of mass dehumanization. Um, by that, I mean that we are moving in an era where it's actually starting to become harder and harder to determine who is actually human because of these technologies. And, I'm someone who, like, I'm always on Facebook, for example, Meta or whatever its name is, right? And one of the things that I had to figure out relatively early on, and we're in an insane era now, is that a huge number of the people on your social media feed who are saying the worst things, the people applauding when they see some kind of cruelty or whatever. Just track who is actually saying that. Very often it's coming from a bot. And there have been all sorts of revelations since that. A huge part of the Trump sort of MAGA social media presence is simply bots. They're bots, they're AI, they're machines. They're not real people. They're there to simply basically waste your time and also to give you the illusion that the project of MAGA is way more popular than it actually is. And before we get into the discussion, one of the few things that I can say that I actually think is as positive is that it is very, very clear that despite the use of this technology by MAGA and despite the immense power and the immense wealth that is concentrated at the top of MAGA, which is basically a marriage of white nationalism and sort of the tech oligarchy, um, if you look at poll numbers, it is very clear. MAGA is a minority movement. It is not a majority movement. And all of these tools, like, AI and bots and everything, are there to make you believe that the movement is more popular than it is. And media is a big piece of this, right? Like, the one of the reasons why we struggle with organizing in this era is because of the control that MAGA increasingly has over our media. In some ways, I often tell people that right now we have two different medias. There's like the regular media, New York Times, CNN, all of those places where most of us get our news, and they have their biases, believe me. But then there's also conservative news. And conservative news is fantasy land. Fantasy land. It completely exists to deify Trump and to basically push all that dehumanizing agenda without any dissent. Um, my sense is that a lot of people who are MAGA, they're really not concerned about CNN and those places. A lot of these folks, I mean, I've actually spoken to some of the folks in the MAGA right. Some of them actually believe that Fox News is too liberal. Fox News is nowhere near how far to the right you can go. Fox News occasionally has accidental displays of news. For example, they will show an accurate poll that will show something about the unpopularity of Trump. And that actually angers a lot of their audience who move towards even further out in the right wing towards media outlets like Newsmax and One American News. I think that the My Pillow guy has like has a channel. Like conservatives live in a different era, but the good news in a different world. But the good news is that we absolutely do have the majority of the people. They just have the institutionalized power. Um, and maybe I'll just stop here so that we can sort of continue a discussion about this rather than me sort of continuing to elaborate. And I forgive me for this talk going from one topic to another, but I do think that there is some level of coherence to this project of dehumanization that we are all going through. That is making us ignore the immense harm that is happening in our names, both domestically and internationally. And I'll stop here so that we could get into a little bit of a discussion, or um, yeah, I'll just stop here for the moment and let folks ask questions. Or Stanley, I'm not sure if you wanted to have a break before we get into more of a discussion. I'm not sure about the structure here.
Laura was going to talk a bit more about PEP. I hope her audio is good.
Yes, hopefully my audio is better now. So yes, for those who are just joining us, I'm Laura Schleifer. I am the program chair with Promoting Enduring Peace. We are an organization that has been around since 1952. We are a historic U.S. peace organization. And recently, some of the work that we've been doing has been to sponsor and promote work that's being done that we believe is furthering the cause of peace on Earth, peace with Earth, which is our dual mission of world peace and also climate justice. And so in the last few years, we have given our Gandhi Peace Award to Kali Akuno and Cooperation Jackson. For those who don't know, Cooperation Jackson is an amazing project in Jackson, Mississippi, where the community has basically started to empower themselves to take control of their own land and community to prevent it from gentrification and grow their own food and have mutual aid-based systems of social services. For example, when the community was flooded, they mobilized a network of communities to provide water cleaning services that the state was not offering. So that was our most recent Gandhi Peace Award winner. We also have 2 new awards that we are giving out, and actually 3 new awards. One of them is the Courage Award, which recently went to Dr. Abu Safia in Gaza. He was a Gazan doctor that was treating patients at a hospital that was raided by Israeli forces, destroyed by Israeli forces, and he himself was taken just before that and imprisoned, and he is still in prison today. We also, and that's our Courage Award. We also have our Dorothy Day Award, and that was recently given to Mahmoud Khalil, who many of you may know is a Palestinian student activist, a big organizer at Columbia with the encampments there. And he was arrested and detained by ICE. And he was released, but now he's going to be going back into detention. So those are some of the recent awards that we've been giving. And then the other one, which is a brand new award, is the Mutual Aid Activist Award. And the very first recipient of that is Anas Arafat of Plant the Land team. And for those of you who don't know, Anas Arafat is a mutual aid local Gazan activist, humanitarian aid activist in Gaza, who runs a team where they provide plant-based food and various materials for the community to be able to survive Israel's ongoing genocide, and actually long before that as well. So those are some of our more recent awards. We are asking, and also activities, and we are asking everyone to please join Promoting Enduring Peace. We really want to build momentum as a peace organization that is addressing these two core issues from many different angles. So looking, as Aly was saying, about the intersections between, the fascism, the persecution of immigrants, the persecution of trans people, the genocide in Gaza, the bombing of Iran, the et cetera, U.S. imperialism and war and climate change, and how that's displacing people and causing them to become refugees. So it is $20 to join. That is for the year. And actually, we donate most of that money to aid in Palestine and elsewhere, direct aid. So please do join Promoting Enduring Peace. And yes, and then, I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation with Aly.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
um, that's great. I'm
that's great. I'm
happy to
happy to
continue the
continue
discussion.
this.
Oh, I'm getting a strange echo. Oh, there we go. Now it's doing okay. Um, so one of the things that I wanted to kind of end on before we sort of do a more formal Q&A or a back and forth is simply the fact that I think that one of the fuels of this crisis of mass dehumanization is um, a kind of an embrace of the numbness of empire. Um, I think that unfortunately in this country, it is almost seen as the value sometimes even in a gendered way, because it's seen as a masculine thing, right? To to not grieve, to not stop and pause about this cruelty. If anything, I'm sure some of you have seen some of the discourse that happens within MAGA. There's a kind of almost kind of teenage egging on of like cruelty that, whereas maybe, you will see something that's deeply cruel and your heart will break. Very often in the MAGA discourse, it's the other way around. It's that, the more cruelty there is, the more praise you get. The incentives within MAGA are almost reversed, that you gain power by this display of cruelty. This is how we get to Stephen Miller basically being like Trump's number two right now, is because Stephen Miller is someone who has kind of mastered this kind of form of empty cruelty, empty masculinity. And certainly Trump is an avatar of patriarchy. Like, it is very obvious that he is the daddy to a lot of the folks who follow Trump, who follow him, right? Um, but beyond just the technical aspects of organizing against this, we also have to continue to insist insist on the value of every human life and refuse to pass over all of this cruelty as if it's nothing. Refuse to see, over 1 million people dying of COVID and not pause about what that means. I mean, just the other day, we just began this attack on Iran, right? And obviously, I'm already mourning some of the civilians, but I was thinking about I happened to read the story of one of the soldiers, one of the U.S. soldiers that just got killed, 20-year-old kid, and I kept thinking, I have already lived 2.5 times as much as that kid has lived. He's gone. He's gone. His family is mourning. The expanded community around him is mourning. And that is true for every single one of the civilian lives that is being snuffed out, in these wars. Like I mentioned, we're already at 2,200 if we put together Iran and Lebanon. And the fact that it is not a central point of conversation within the US media should tell you how far we have gone in the process of dehumanization. I'll even give you an example of quote unquote liberal dehumanization. I would call this liberal dehumanization. Once we finally got to the sort of proximate end of the US fighting in Iraq, right? And we had invaded the country and tons of Iraqis lost their lives in this fighting, and it was sold, of course, as we're there to promote democracy, blah 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 blah. But remember the way Democrats talked about our exit to the war. They were saying, "Oh, you know what? The U.S. has done enough. We have worked hard enough at their democracy." And I remember the phrase was, "It's time for the Iraqis to stand up and be counted." And I remember thinking to myself, really? Really? Like, really? Like, the US, for all of the casualties that the US went through, it was a pittance compared to the civilian casualties that the Iraqis went through. I mean, all of this carnage is how we got to ISIS, by the way. It was a direct result of our imperial meddling. And it's because it created so much pain, so much misery. But the way the exit out of Iraq was sold in our media was like, oh, those Iraqis, like we've done enough for them. Don't you think it's time for them to step up to the plate? Think about how dehumanizing that is. That tells you we don't see these people as actual human beings. We see them at best as puppets, and we're seeing exactly the same thing of the Iranians right now. Exactly the same thing. Because they are also in these situations, there are, I would say, two forms of dehumanization. There's a kind of dehumanization that comes with the Islamophobia that comes with this system. And make no mistake, we are in an epidemic of dehumanizing Islamophobia right now. Just look at the Mamdani race. And here I'm talking about the Democrats. I'm not even talking about the country at large, right? Um, so we're going through this immense amount of oh, sorry, I think I kind of lost my train of thought here. Um, so yeah, so the way that it was framed was that we had to leave Iraq because it was time for them. Oh, that's right. I was talking about the two forms of dehumanization. Right. Okay. So one of the forms of dehumanization is a kind of like, oh, these Iraqis, insert Muslim person here, are, they're not like us. They don't believe in liberal values. They're cruel. They're monsters. I mean, certainly if you hear anyone talking about the Iranian regime, like that's how it's talked about. This is not a defense of the Iranian regime that has clearly committed human rights abuses. I'm just saying how we're talking about Iranians in general. So that's one form of dehumanization. But the other form of dehumanizing is infantilization, which is the same thing, like the same thing that happened in Iraq is the same thing that's happened with Iranians. I mean, if you listen to the rhetoric behind our attack on Iraq, it's just kind of like on Iran recently, and the Trump administration has been forefront, with this particular language. They're basically trying to sell the idea to the American people that like the Iranians are they're begging for us to bomb them. Like that's what they want because they quote unquote they want their freedom. And there is a real world conversation to be had about this. There are Iranian dissidents who have been fighting, protesting. I mean, that's true. And there has been a small contingent of people who at the beginning were just like, oh, well, let's see where this goes. But like it's gone so badly already that there have been several articles in mainstream US outlets, even as we're just beginning this war, who are basically saying like, well, yeah, actually the few people who were originally thinking, well, we'll see where this goes, are already saying like, this is not the way to liberation. You're killing us. You're killing us. So that's another form of dehumanization is this kind of infantilizing of the people in the Middle East as if they don't have actual agency. Um, and that is also a part of the laziness that comes with the numbness that's informed by the empire. But certainly, I would like to spend the rest of this time talking to you about what you think about this era that we're going through, but also certainly one of the things that I'm interested in, maybe to start moving us out of this conversation, is to maybe collectively think about strategies to resist this numbness. Because I really do think that this numbness, this kind of habituation to death without honoring the process of grief is extremely dangerous. It's dangerous because of the policies we allow, but I think it's dangerous because of who it makes us become. We become hollow when we lose our connection to the humanity of other people. Whenever I see some of the leaders in MAGA right now, who I think represent the worst of sort of the American tradition, but are very much in that American tradition, I think of them as hollow people. They're not, and I'm not dehumanizing them. What I'm saying is that they have so divorced themselves from what this looks like in real time for people, that it's a game to them. I mean, listen to quote unquote Secretary of War Pete Hegseth when he's talking about this. He's talking about this like it's a video game. You know, Trump just made a statement the other day about how he was thinking about bombing Karg Island one more time because he was just like, oh, just for fun. For fun. This is where we're at. This is the level of cruelty and dehumanization that we've gotten where these people, I don't think they're even real to the people at the top right now. I don't think they're real. I think that the only real people in their lives are the ultra wealthy. And that's who they are really sort of playing for right now. So I'm gonna stop here so we could have this broader conversation about dehumanization and, like I mentioned, maybe potentially strategies to resist this numbness, which I think fuels all of this.
So Aly, this is a really super thought-provoking conversation. I've been writing down like notes as you've been speaking about things that I would want to bring up. I First of all, I want to mention that we had a previous Shafer lecturer whose name is Christopher Sebastian McJetters. And he actually spoke about the role of animalization in dehumanization. This whole thing about comparing the targeted group of humans to animals, and then, of course, the devaluation of non-human animals themselves, and how this idea that, if we see them as so inferior that you can do anything to them and it doesn't matter and you don't have to have a conscience about it, then really it's only a matter of likening a certain group of humans to animals. Oh, they're more like animals, those animals, blah, blah, blah. And then it seems justifiable in the eyes of a lot of people to do those things to them, to quote unquote treat them like an animal. So, yeah, I was really interested to hear your thoughts on that.
No, that's right on in the sense that I often joke about the fact that I'm working towards vegetarianism because I really do think that there is a connection. And it's interesting that this is happening now. I see some people in the audience who are from Syracuse who are friends. Uh, uh, I just lost my wonderful pet, Misha, our dog that we had for 16 years. Like, I've been crying over it. Like, I have no shame about the fact that I've been crying over this little creature that provided us so much joy. And certainly, I mean, if you look at the modern industrial kind of meat production process, I mean, even if you support it, like there's no no way to look at that without acknowledging that it is an immensely cruel process. And we live in a capitalist era where it is hard to have clean hands from that, you know. But it is, I do think, one of the moral questions of the era that I hope that if we have a future, that that hopefully, future generations are going to be able to help us solve. But certainly the language of war, which is obviously the language of genocide, the language of genocide is just sort of heightened from the regular language of war, is the language of animalization. I mentioned sort of my roots in that experience of the pre-genocide war in Rwanda. And one of the things that was famous from that time was, the the Hutus, who were one of the ethnic groups, committing this genocide, would refer to their enemies as cockroaches. Cockroaches. And in every major war project, there's some level of dehumanization and animalization. And I mean, my God, like the if you and it's both internationally and domestically. If you hear some MAGA people talking about, for example, immigrants here, or some people talking about, Iraqis, Palestinians, very often the first insult is they will use some language that's connected to animalization. Um, so that's really a call for all of us to do better to these our fellow animals, like I certainly believe that, like, I think one of the things about human beings, I often tell people that I feel like human beings, we are the animal who forgot that we are an animal because of our cleverness and our intelligence. Like, we've forgotten that we are absolutely connected to those other creatures, and that this animalization language is really an insult. It's a self-insult, because that's also, whether you want to call it nature, whether you want to call it creation or whatever, we are part of the same garment. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. I'm glad to hear that you had a speaker who got to elaborate on that.
Yeah, I always think it's ironic that, humans think that the reason why we don't see ourselves as other, and as animals is because of our intelligence or our cleverness. Because, the irony is that that's not an indication that we are intelligent, that we don't recognize ourselves as animals. The irony is that there's kind of like always the mirror test that's used. Can the animal recognize themselves in the mirror? If they are able to recognize themselves, that's a sign of, self-awareness and intelligence. But we don't even recognize ourselves, especially, I'm going to say, white people, right, who created this whole system of animalization, but they don't think that they are animals themselves. But of course, all humans are animals. We are a species of animal, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought this up, and maybe we can open it up to other folks in the audience.
Yeah. Are there other questions for Aly?
Yeah, I have my hand. So I think in terms of talking about strategy, how to get out of this, one needs to talk about exploitation and labor solidarity. There's an article from 5 days ago in the New York Times, and it talks about, well, forget about morality for a second. Let's talk about the promise of the Trump administration. Throwing the immigrants out of the country is going to get higher wages for American workers, and there'll be a 100% American workforce. Well, so he's been at it. He was at it from 2016 to 2020, but certainly much more in the last year. So what's the result? Well, there's such a lack of farm labor that they're recruiting people overseas. They're recruiting people from Latin America in a program called H2A. And if people if you're as old as I am, they used to call it the Bracero program. So you would, take these benefits. You would come to the U.S. and, work for the government, or rather work for farmers at terrible benefits. You got the worst, the poorest of the poor. So instead of raising wages so that Americans, whites, whatever, will go and get those jobs, that's not happening. They're instead, at the same time, throwing people out of the country. They're bringing them back into the country with this program. And we've got to let people understand that, because if the people who just cared about self-interest could understand that, then maybe they could reject this whole anti-immigrant scam. Done.
Yeah, yeah, and certainly what is important to say here is that we can't have a real analysis of all this without talking about capitalism and labor exploitation, because that's really at the heart of what you want to call what people are calling sort of the immigration crisis. The sort of modern version of the immigration crisis is really got kickstarted after the free trade agreement of the 1990s. The North American Free Trade Agreement was passed. And I'm bringing that up because what that free trade agreement did, in a sort of simplified sort of way of explaining it, is that it basically allowed corporations to move from country to country to be able to find cheaper exploitable labor, to find cheaper workers, right? And so in the South in the US, there used to be this kind of manufacturing base, but then multinational corporations decided, yeah, we want to find cheaper workers. And so what ended up happening after the free trade agreement was passed was that those factories moved south to Mexico, so that the employers, capital, could find even cheaper labor. But then what ended up happening was that once the wages in Mexico and these factories started to go higher, those same factories moved all the way to Southeast Asia so that those factory owners could find even cheaper workers. And that created a sort of competition between the workers who were abandoned by that early capital flight, those US workers, and the Mexican workers who eventually got exploited by the same system and who ended up trying to migrate north to try to find work. And so all that does is create a kind of a system of divide and conquer between the working classes. Like multinational corporations don't care about borders. They're just trying to make money. But that's part of this crisis that we're dealing with, is this imbalance between capital and factories being able to cross borders and destabilize economies, while at the same time, sort of nationalistic sentiment and, of course, very often racism is used to harden borders, and it creates this competition when in fact there should be labor solidarity. I often talk to people about how the natural allies of working class U.S. workers are undocumented workers. So that is I mean, you hit it on the head in terms of the connection. And everyone knew. I mean, every serious person understood that once you do a program of mass deportations, you're going to run out of laborers. And that is not just conjecture, by the way. As part of my immigrant organizing, I remember participating in this campaign in the early 2010s called the Take Our Jobs campaign. And it was the farm workers union. And the idea of the Take Our Jobs campaign is that there were all of this rhetoric, right, from the right about how, like, well, if U.S. workers had access to these jobs, blah blah blah, we would be able to, have a better country, quote unquote. So what the Farm Workers Union did was they created a campaign where they created a bunch of farming positions. They hiked up the wages of those positions. So it wasn't even at the rate that they normally would give. I think they like doubled the wages, something like that. Um, and they basically told Americans, like, come on and take these jobs, try it out, see what happens. And sure enough, out of this nationwide campaign, they got a couple of hundred people who signed up, and out of those couple of hundred people who signed up, the great majority left within a week, you know. Um, People call this quote unquote unskilled labor. It is backbreaking, extremely complex labor that buttresses the American economy. And of course, once you start doing mass deportations, I mean, you're gonna go after basically your labor force. I tell Americans all the time, if you've eaten any food in this country, you should probably thank an undocumented worker because a lot of our farm workers are undocumented. So I was not at all surprised to see that the Trump administration had to a certain degree, reverse course, because that's when you get into, the complaints of farm owners. And here, when I say farm owners, I'm not talking about small farms. Of course, I'm really talking about big agribusinesses. So, yeah.
Okay, other questions for Aly? Aly, you brought up so many different topics. There were a couple of points that I wanted to bring up that I thought were really kind of worth looking at. One was this whole thing about choice rhetoric. Really, like interesting and disturbing that even with the undocumented immigrants, it's it's your choice to not pursue citizenship. Of course, we're all familiar with the ways that that's weaponized against marginalized people, and I'm thinking especially about homelessness, right? Oh, and just poverty in general. Oh, well, it's your choice. You don't want to work. You don't want to, do what it takes to get off the streets, etc. And then I was also thinking about how far that logic is taken. And again, even by the liberals, let alone MAGA, right? Like I'm thinking about, for example, when Obama was president and, he ordered this drone attack on this Yemeni who they claimed was, involved with terrorism, but then they not only killed that man, but then they hunted down his family and they killed his father and then they killed his teenage son. And then, when they were questioned about it, they said, well, I think it was the Secretary of Defense at the time, which I think it's actually like a de-Orwellianization to call him the Secretary of War. It's much more honest, actually. But, he said, well, he should have chosen a better father. They literally said that the boy should have chosen a better father, as if this was a choice. So, I kind of wanted to highlight just how far that logic can be taken. Yeah. I see we did get we have some questions, I think, that came in. We have a comment from Carol Barton regarding resistance to numbness. I fear it's mostly when people feel directly impacted that they respond. When criminalization and killings were about immigrants, many citizens could ignore it. When ICE and Border Patrol shot white U.S. citizens in the streets, there was a national outcry. It speaks to the racialization of the issue. But the positive aspect is that it has brought average citizens into the streets in solidarity with migrant neighbors. As you say, migrants are the canary in the coal mine. There is a broader surveillance and suppression agenda, but my hope emerged from Minneapolis that this can also lead to solidarity and unnumbing. And then we have a question from Anna Ciaslo. What are your thoughts on grief and ways that we can grieve together?
Yeah, all this
Yeah,
is
all
that.
this is
I
like
Oh, still hearing that echo there. Oh, there we go. Great. Yeah, no, this is excellent. I did not want to lose your point about the language of choice, especially its connection to actually liberal politics, because, you can trace a lot of the kind of demonizing of immigrants and the poor to a lot of the policies passed by Bill Clinton in the 90s. Bill Clinton, during the whole sort of welfare reform process, is really the one who just weaponized that language of choice to basically take away assistance money from poor people through the language of, efficiency and reforming, quote unquote, the system. Um, but he also, as he was using this language of choice to kind of demonize the poor to a certain degree, the same process was happening with immigrants. In fact, a lot of immigrant organizers who are really in the know that like this era of mass demonizing of immigrants and mass criminalization of immigrants started with the 1996 laws passed by Bill Clinton. It was pre 9/11, and he was using the same language. And the connection here was you should always be worried when you hear these terms like deserving versus undeserving. It was the same thing, the deserving poor versus the undeserving poor, deserving immigrants versus undeserving immigrants. Whenever you hear that dichotomy happen, your ears should like raise up and realize like there's something wrong happening here. So that language of choice again, that like you should that people kind of deserve kind of poverty if they don't fulfill certain criteria. Um, but in terms of the other pieces, the first I did want to just for like a second acknowledge the bravery of the Minneapolis protesters and all sorts of other places as well. Chicago had amazing resistance. LA before then. Um, I don't want to leave people here feeling like, oh, it's just we're living this massive cruelty and no one's doing anything. If anything, one of the more positive things about the MAGA era is that whenever you see a reaction, there's an action, you see a reaction. And people have shown up. I may have a lot of issues with the Democratic Party and the way that they deal with this, but that's separate from how I feel about the people at the grassroots who have shown up. And I do, even though as an immigrant organizer, believe you me, I have a lot more names of people who were killed than Alex Preddy and Renee Good. I, of course, send my love and respect and admiration to their spirits for what they were able to ignite, but it also gave us a sense of how far this crisis of mass dehumanization had grown. Because I gotta tell you, like the overwhelming majority of my time being an immigrant organizer, like I did not see white people in those organizing spaces. Like before the Trump era, I genuinely can think of maybe three white immigrants that I saw in immigrant organizing spaces. And that's because Border Patrol and ICE knows that when they're targeting non-citizens, they're targeting non-white folks. But it wasn't until the Trump's second era that I started to see actually more white immigrants join us in organizing spaces, which gave me a sense of how far the concentric circles of dehumanization had gotten. Because honestly, it's not like I was looking back at those times and thinking to myself like, well, why aren't those white people demonized just like me? It's like I clearly wasn't thinking about that, right? I was thinking to myself, how do we reduce the overall level? And so it does not make me happy to see more and more even white undocumented immigrants go through the system. Um, but I do think that because of this identification with whiteness, it's gotten even to Trump. It's gotten to Trump. And this is not to give you a sense of like, oh, we've got this and everything. No, we are so much in the fight. But just last week, Trump started telling his Republican congresspersons to not mention mass deportations, to not mention mass deportations. Like, That's what Trump does, right? And I am 100% clear that we would not have gotten to that place if it weren't for the murder of Renee Good and Alex Preddy. The taking of those white U.S. citizen lives was enough to wake up the system. I think it's going to increase solidarity as a whole. And I think it did spook the Trump administration. Now, we still have a long ways to go because the mass detention centers are coming. You know, you can call in concentration camps, whatever you want. It's still happening. But that just gives you a sense of not only are they vulnerable, but thankfully, more and more white people are starting to see through the con. They're starting to see through the con that somehow like, well, like you may be struggling and be poor and all of that stuff, but at the very least, you're not like those lazy criminal undocumented immigrants or whatever. And that's just a con. That's a con to divide and conquer the working class. And which, by the way, speaking of old logics that are resurfaced, that is literally the con that was at the foundation of this country, the separation between poor white indentured Europeans and imported Africans who eventually became slaves. Like the ruling class at the time, that was their bargain. They were basically like, well, you may be poor, you may not have a lot of property or anything, but you're not like those N-words, That's that at the very least you have that status. And certainly even back then, there were white people who were able to see through the illusion and break and move towards acts of solidarity. And their descendants are Renee Good and Alex Preddy. People who understand that we are absolutely, connected and I think we are actually running out of time, but I did not want to miss. There's a piece about thoughts around grieving. I just think that from a even from a pragmatic point of view, not just a spiritual point of view, um, it is just unhealthy to experience this much death without taking the time to acknowledge it. One of the groups that I worked with for a while was the Undocu Black Network. As is implied in the name, we do a lot of organizing of undocumented Black folks. But it's a wonderful group that has one of the positions is called the Healing Justice Coordinator, and it's someone who helps us try to do work in ways that feel healthy. And I remember after, it was one of the many mass shootings that's happened here, but it was the Buffalo mass shooting in that actually happened, pretty when was that Buffalo shooting? It was just a couple of years ago. Um, and the shooter was a white supremacist who was animated by the racist Great Replacement theory, which, by the way, according to polls, at least 50% of Republicans believe in that Great Replacement theory. And for the people who don't know what the Great Replacement theory is, it's basically white people are being replaced by the darker races. I can get into sort of the nuances of it, but that's about it. But that grace replacement theory is very often used to um, demonize immigrants, but it's really just about people of color. And so while this man believed in the great replacement theory, when he went into that store to shoot Black folks, all he cared about was not whether or not they were citizens or not. He just wanted to shoot Black people, right? And at the Undocu Black Network, obviously, all of us were organizers, understood the heaviness of that. The fact that in his mind, there was no difference between a Black immigrant and an African American. And we went into the days, our team meeting, and everyone was clearly in pain. And our healing justice coordinator, she was just like, okay, we're not going to do this. We're not going to do what this country tells us to do, which is to bypass this grief. We're gonna check in with each other for like the next 5 minutes, and then you guys are gonna go home. You're going to relax. You're gonna talk to your friends. You're gonna do something, that you enjoy, and next meeting we're gonna get back to the work. But her whole thing was just like, what's happening out there with all of these people just being like, just another mass shooting. What are you gonna do? She was like, that is how you die. Like that is how you lose your soul, is when you start to get used to these mass shootings or to these school shootings. And certainly we live in the land of the gun here, which, you know, obviously supercharges this cruelty. And so that's just a simple example of like in our workplace, kind of this call to remember the importance of grief, which is obviously countercultural to America, which supposedly worships quote unquote productivity. But part of being human is also acknowledging that some of the most valuable things take time, and grief takes time, and you should take the time that you need, whether it's grieving something that's social justice related, whether it's grieving a friend. You should absolutely give yourself the permission to take the time away to process that, and to process that, you know, in community if you can, or by yourself, so that you can get back to the work. Because the point of that example was not like, oh, we fell apart because we felt the grief of it. No, it was just like we acknowledge the pain, like ouch, right? Like it's hurtful to be reminded again and again through these brutal examples that this country does not want you to be alive. That wears at you at a certain point. But it was this sense of just like just acknowledge it, let that process in your body. And then when you get back into the fight, you'll be refreshed, you'll have more energy to fight. And I think that's also one of the reasons this era of numbness is winning over, is that people are tired, they're exhausted. There's so much grief like in the background that just accumulates. And very often, people aren't even conscious that they're grieving. That's how much death this country produces that we don't acknowledge. So just never believe the lie in this country that you're just supposed to bypass, you know, all of this stuff. So, yeah.
Aly, thank you. That was such a beautiful and thought provoking and inspiring response and talk overall. And we just really, really want to thank you for being our Shafer Lecturer this year. I think this was really meaningful. And I'm getting a lot of comments here saying that as well. And actually, we had a last question, which was how can we harness the momentum of No Kings? So I don't know if you want to take a couple of extra minutes to speak to that, but on the subject of No Kings, Promoting Enduring Peace will be at the No Kings rally in Hartford on Saturday. We will have a table there. Please come and check us out and talk to us. We would really love to connect with you. And Aly, we would love to hear your response on that.
Oh yeah, no,
Oh, yeah, no, this is.
this is great. And what I mean by that is I'm a big fan of No Kings rallies. Um, Not because they have like a perfect political message or anything. If anything, I tend to do the type of grassroots work and organizing that is very niche and lefty, and we can have our like specific rules about how everything should go and everything. But No Kings is about mass protest. It's about having bodies there basically saying no to all of this. But the way to think about how this relates to what I was just talking about is that you should think of No Kings as your opportunity to connect with others, to get to know other people from whether they're whether they're from other movements or they're simply people who've come up and shown up for the first time. This is your opportunity to talk to someone maybe from a completely different identity. And then to start to connect and think about, oh, wait, what issues, you know, we have in common? I think of No Kings as kind of like this opportunity for, you know, those of us on the left and those of us who are more mainstream liberal and centrist and everything to get together and basically say, this era of mass cruelty does not speak for us. And the thing is, you know, sometimes people say like No Kings isn't working. And like, if you're talking about a specific piece of legislation, like, sure. But No Kings is scaring these people. It really is. The reaction every time there is one of these protests from MAGA is certainly one of demonization, but also one of clear stress and fear. And so you shouldn't get too hung up, I think, on going there with the perfect coalition or having the perfect politics. I mean, I certainly know that as someone who has participated in No Kings protests, that like, yeah, I mean, I can't speak to the politics of every speaker and everything. But you can go to those spaces with curiosity, with genuine curiosity about who is there. And the further from your identity that person is, the better, the better. Because that's your opportunity to see, oh my God, we actually have way more in common than we don't. Which actually reminds me of one of my favorite facts about immigrant organizing, as depressing as all of this is. And this is worldwide, it's not just in the US. Uh, Areas with the least immigrants are the areas that tend to be the most anti-immigrant, which tells you that the more proximity you have to immigrants, the less you are susceptible to these racist, xenophobic messages. And that is also connected to No Kings, so that's community, right? And that's organizing. I mean, organizing always starts with community. It doesn't start with like two people who've never seen each other, just like randomly, sort of determining a goal. It starts with, like something is not great in my life. And then this other person says, you know what? Like, I actually have something that's like very similar to that. You start to get into community, you talk, the group gets big enough, you realize, oh, maybe there's someone who can do something about this, So, um, community is definitely the antidote to all of this, to this numbness, to this indifference, because this era of MAGA and technology and AI and everything is making you think that other people don't exist. They're just on your screens, right? But no, no, like we have way more power working together than we do separate. Even as obviously, there will always be tensions within coalitions, but with this type of fascism that we're facing, which is certainly the worst that I've seen since I've been in this country, now is the time to really think about how we can do coalition work. And coalition work is some of the hardest work to do, but it can also be really great because it forces you to look at things from a different perspective and to think about idealism versus pragmatism, all of those things. So yeah, no, I mean the whole my thing is the whole thing about No Kings is like this is your opportunity to get to know people from different places and to get the regime to realize that even if all their armies of bots and AI and everything and we're seeing it in the poll numbers. The popularity of MAGA keeps going down steadily, 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 steadily. And I think, things like No Kings push us in the right direction. It's not just going to your congressman or doing a radical action. These types of protests can make a huge difference.
Yeah, Aly, I really appreciate, your ability to see things from other perspectives and to, kind of emphasize how important that is that we get out of our echo chambers and we have actual conversations with people outside of our perspectives. And like you said, I mean, that really is at the core of even why there's so much anti-immigrant sentiment is because they don't communicate with immigrants, right? So yeah, really, really important points. And I think also, interesting to kind of look at the No Kings from the perspective of what you said earlier about this issue of, that we don't have democracy in this country. Very often that's kind of framed in terms of, voting for your representative. That's the liberal framing. But, as you said, really on a profound level that we don't have any say in the decisions like, do we attack and bomb and invade another country, right? So that's really something that I think is really kind of important to emphasize here about, No Kings, and we the people are supposed to have the decision-making power. So yeah, really wonderful talk. Thank you so much. And for everybody attending, please check out our website, pepeace.org, and please join Promoting Enduring Peace, become a member, get more involved. We will, of course, be hosting a lot more of these types of events and speakers from all different areas of peace and climate justice movements. And please do also come and talk with us if you are in Connecticut. Come on Hartford Saturday, March 28th to the No Kings rally and have a conversation with us there. Okay, thank you so much. This concludes this year's Shafer Lecture. And thank you, Aly. Thank you, Stan and Dan. And thank you to everyone who attended. And we will see you next time. Okay, bye.